Hi, this is Melvin McLeod, the editor-at-large of Lion's Roar. This year, we're celebrating the 90th birthday of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And although he is in good health, as far as we know, and receiving the best of medical care, it is an appropriate time to start to think about what will happen with his passing, which will be an event of historic importance both for the world and for the Tibetan people. To talk about this, I'm joined now by Carole McGranahan, who is an expert in Tibetan history and contemporary politics and a professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Thank you very much, Carole, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, as we know, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has played two historic roles. One is as a global moral, ethical, and spiritual leader, and the other is as the leader of the Tibetan people through as difficult, as tragic a situation as any people have experienced in modern times. So, and I think it's also fair to say that he has navigated through his people through those times in an extraordinarily skillful and successful way, while remaining true to the values of the Buddhism that, of course, he is one of the world's leading leaders of. So, just briefly, what is his passing going to mean for the Tibetan people and their overall situation?
Yeah, so let me start by saying I love how you frame that the Dalai Lama is a global leader as well as the leader of the Tibetan people. And the 14th Dalai Lama has been called upon, right, to be in that role. Truly someone who has been here for the world as well as for Tibet. So the current Dalai Lama is the 14th one, born in 1935, so just celebrated his 90th birthday. And historically, there have always been plans in place, right, to find the succession when a next Dalai Lama needs to be found. So finding the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama is something Tibetans have been doing for centuries, literally. So the Dalai Lama is both, or historically, has been both the political and the religious leader of Tibet. That dates back to 1642. So this is for a very long time. With the establishment of what the Tibetans call the Gandham Podrong, which is the government in Tibetan Chutsi, religion and politics together. And the Dalai Lama, as the religious and political leader, has been the one who holds together the Tibetan community. He is the symbol of Tibet. And so at this moment, when, for the last, over 6 decades, the Tibetan community has been fractured, has been split. Initially split between those who remained inside Tibet after the Chinese invasion, occupation, and colonization of Tibet, and those who fled with the Dalai Lama to India in 1959, kind of both South Asia, then India, Nepal, and then inside Tibet. Starting from the 1990s, Tibetans started moving out of South Asia. So now, like right here in Boulder, in the Boulder-Denver corridor, we have a large population of Tibetans. The largest in North America are New York City and Toronto. If we go over to Europe, you have London, you have Zurich, you have Paris. So really, Tibetan's now a global diaspora. His Holiness stepped down from political leadership in 2011. So that now is something where the leadership of Tibet is now a democratically elected leader, but His Holiness still remains not just the religious leader, but really, again, the center of the community, the person and the deity, really, the bodhisattva, right, in which you as a Buddhist practitioner, as a Tibetan, might put your depa or your faith, right? Someone who's not just a leader in any sort of garden variety sense, but someone who is truly special and truly unique in the world. So the loss of the Dalai Lama at a time when the community is spread around the world, when China continues to be the colonial ruler of Tibet, right? So the Tibetan sovereignty, Tibetan consolidation, the reunion, right, of Tibetans inside and outside Tibet hasn't yet been secured. The loss of the leader, right, and then the uncertainty of that period in between, right, the Dalai Lama, who's in English we would use the words like in his majority, right, an adult, fully stepped into the power and the role, and someone who's a child, right, and it's because you find the next Dalai Lama is often found, very ages roughly I don't know, 2 to 4, perhaps. So a young boy, or perhaps a young girl, something we could discuss, who needs to be trained, be taught, have teachers and mentors, right, and learn what it means to be a Dalai Lama before they can fully step into the role. So there's going to be a period of at least, roughly a decade or two, when the Dalai Lama will be very young, and fears, uncertainty. Also, let's be honest, it's not just about that. It's also about the real grief and mourning that will take place at the loss of this particular Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, who has been, in some ways, such a singular leader, right, for the Tibetan community.
So let's get a bit of background now on the ways in which, in the Tibetan system, important teachers and leaders, of which the Dalai Lama, I would try to say, is the most important, are indeed recognized. So first of all, what is the kind of theological understanding that comes from Buddhism, but is actually unique to the Tibetan Buddhist world, whereby an important teacher or leader is reincarnated? And then by what process traditionally is that assumed reincarnation found? And how will that actually play out now in the modern world, in the light of the modern world? So how has it been done? How is it done traditionally? How will it be done in this case?
Right. So I'll speak from the example of the Dalai Lama, given that that's our conversation, rather than do it generally. So the Dalai Lama lineage are emanations of the deity Avalokiteshvara, right, in Sanskrit, or Chenrezig in Tibetan. So this is a deity who has chosen to appear on earth in human form. So an emanation, so not truly is, right, the deity. And given that we are in the 14th reincarnation of the deity has chosen to come back 14 successive times, right, to be on earth, to help others on the path to enlightenment, right? So is a bodhisattva. The current Dalai Lama, the 14th again, was born in 1935. And I think the best way to give a sense of what the reincarnation process looks like, or could potentially look like, is to share the process of finding him, right? How was he found? So the Dalai Lama before him, the 13th, before he passed away, he had a last will and testament, gave kind of some predictions for what might happen. So the Dalai Lama before, whoever is in that role, might actually give some clues, might give some direct instructions, right, for here is where to look. So that could happen even before a Dalai Lama passes away. The other thing that happens is that there are a series of individuals who are trained to look for reincarnations, primarily through divination. Right. So who could do all sorts of things. And in Tibet, for anyone who's not real familiar with Tibet, there are a whole range of divinatory practices, from divining raven calls to looking into an oracle lake. Tibet has a state oracle. I think it's one of the only governments in the world, right, that has an actual government official who is an oracle. The state oracle will go into trance and will deduce and receive information about the next the next Dalai Lama, where the next reincarnation could be found. There are, other places on the land where you could seek information. There's also, you could do a mo, like a rolling of dice. So there's many. I'm just throwing out some of the most common, most popular. In the context of this Dalai Lama, the current one, the 14th, information was given that said to go to the northeast part of the country and to look for a house with unusual gutters and unusual roof. So a search party, again, people who were trained to find a reincarnation, as well as several of the attendants of the former Dalai Lama, so individuals who had worked closely with him, went to look for a boy, young boy, and they were looking for a boy at that time, between certain ages, right, who had been born at a certain time after the last Dalai Lama had passed. And so they went to all the houses in this one area, that had children of that age. When they got to the home of the current Dalai Lama, they went in, and I'm going to refer to him as His Holiness, at the time he was just a 3-year-old boy, said, "My friends from Tibet, my friends from Lhasa have arrived." Right? Now, as a young 3-year-old boy, he had never been to Lhasa. Right? He had never met these people. So he had a recognition of them that he articulated. They came back. And one of the tests they did when they came back, I don't have two pens, but imagine if I had two pens. I have one here, two pens that are exactly the same, and they placed them down on the table in front of him. And one had belonged to the prior Dalai Lama, and the other had belonged to someone else. They did tests like that with a number of objects, both mundane and ritual. And the young boy each time picked up the correct object, here, a pen, say, this is mine. So they did a number of tests like that, just in situ right there with the child to find out, if it is him, if he was the correct boy. Then back in Lhasa, or perhaps actually on site, there were also a number of divinations as well as consultations that were done to make sure that this was indeed the right child. So there is a whole protocol that has been followed over centuries, and again, that were followed for the finding of the current Dalai Lama as well.
Well, one of the big changes in the modern world is that traditionally there was no doubt that incarnation would be identified inside Tibet. But we'll leave aside for the moment what we expect the Chinese government to do in response to the Dalai Lama's death. But looking purely at the process, which will be undoubtedly guided and controlled by the Tibetan government in exile or establishment in exile, that incarnation could be found inside Tibet, in the Tibetan diaspora, could, under the most extreme circumstances, actually be a non-Tibetan or a woman. Mm-hmm. My own guess is that this is a very conservative establishment that will not find a Westerner or a woman, but nonetheless, where and who do you think that will be in the end the selected child?
So just one thing, actually, 2 Dalai Lamas have been born outside of Tibet. So the 4th Dalai Lama was born in Mongolia, and the 6th Dalai Lama was born in Tawang, which is currently a part of India. So 2 actually have been born outside. So we have clear instructions from the current Dalai Lama on this question. And he has made 2 important statements. One he made in 2011 when he retired from political power, and one he made this spring. So in 2011, what he basically said is that I'm going to make a statement around the time of my 90th birthday, again, which was this year, 2025. But he said, basically, the job to find the Dalai Lama falls to the Tibetan people, and specifically falls to the Ganden Podrang Trust. And again, Ganden Podrang is the name of the Dalai Lama's government. And so this is the trust that's now charged with running, maintaining, preserving, the Dalai Lama, the office of the Dalai Lama. So what he said in 2011 is that body will be in charge, and I will tell you more in 2025. So what we've learned this year, and this spring, he came out with a new book. It's called Voice for the Voiceless. And what he said in this book is that the next Dalai Lama will be born outside of Tibet. So that was the big announcement that was made this year, kind of right around as His Holiness turned 90. So again, as I started, kind of when our first question, as we were discussing, the Tibetan world is now, spread widely around the world. There are massive Tibetan Buddhist organizations, like monasteries from all the different schools in exile in both India and Nepal, as well as a healthy and robust Tibetan community outside of Tibet. I mean, that said, the majority of the Tibetan population still lives in Tibet, right, under Chinese occupation and rule.
So you would expect then the candidate to be found or selected, or whatever you wish, within the Tibetan diaspora.
It's not just that I would expect that. That is what the Dalai Lama has said, and he is the sole person who decides that. So he has the ability to make that decision. So in 2011, he had said one of the other things that is possible was that the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama could happen in what you consider to be the standard way, which is that a Dalai Lama passes away, and then after several years, another reincarnation is born. There's actually another possibility, so something that happens from time to time in Tibetan reincarnations in general, not just with the Dalai Lama lineage, which is called Madetulku. And so in 2011, he said another possibility would be a Madetulku emanation, which would mean that the reincarnation would be born while the current Dalai Lama is still living. He has since said that although he floated that, kind of put that out as a possibility in 2011, that he's no longer talking about that. So that I think he has realized that is not what is going to happen. But where the next reincarnation is born and how is something that only the Dalai Lama can determine. That is something that he controls.
I mean, thinking about this, we're in 2026.
Yeah.
There are 120 or however many governments there are in the world and nations
Right.
that have many different forms of succession from one leader or government to another. And that this particular unique form of succession is still taking place in the 21st century is quite extraordinary, isn't it?
It is. Absolutely. It's unique. So I'm part of a large international interdisciplinary project, right, of scholars trying to look at all the different facets of succession and reincarnation in the Tibetan community, but also looking at political succession in other countries. So looking at monarchies, not just monarchies, democracies, authoritarianism. And the Tibetan case, while having some overlap with some of them, you're right, truly stands alone.
So then the other obvious big player in this is China.
Yes.
There is a pattern of the Chinese offering a competing candidate or child or whatever, the most famous of which is the Panchen Lama. It was at that time, I believe, the second most important figure in the Tibetan hierarchy, and the Chinese put up their own candidate who subsequently disappeared. And of course, the Tibetan government in exile and the Dalai Lama and all Tibetans in the diaspora or inside Tibet want to resist the support for any official Chinese communist Dalai Lama. But how then do you expect them to respond to this? Do you think they will then put forth their own candidate, or simply do their best to resist the candidate put forth effectively by the Tibetan people?
There will absolutely be two Dalai Lamas. However, one will be fraudulent because it will be chosen by China. So let me just say that up front. There will be the Dalai Lama who is recognized, acknowledged, and verified by the Tibetan people. And then there will be one that the Chinese government claims is the real Dalai Lama. So two things. So let's just quickly, let me give a little bit of the history that you just kind of introduced, which is that of the Panchen Lama. So the Panchen Lama is a high reincarnation within the Gelugpa school of Buddhism. This is the school also that the Dalai Lama is from. And in the time following the Dalai Lama's escape, the Panchen Lama was the highest Tibetan Buddhist leader in the Chinese eyes, but very important leader also for the Tibetan people, also in terms of really advocating for Tibetan language and Tibetan just rights and autonomy inside Tibet. When he passed away under suspicious circumstances, the Tibetan government, under the guidance, the exile government under the guidance of the Dalai Lama, worked together with Tibetan leaders inside Tibet to find the next Panchen Lama. This was in the 1990s. This is when this is happening. So now, May 14th, 1995, the Dalai Lama announces that this joint team of Tibetans from exile and Tibetans inside Tibet have found and confirmed the next Panchen Lama. It was a 6-year-old boy, Gendon Shukinima. 3 days later, on May 17th, 1995, that boy and his entire family were disappeared, kidnapped by the Chinese government, and they have never been seen again. So that's now 30 years ago this year. This boy, the Tibetan verified Panchen Lama, was kidnapped, disappeared, and at the time was the world's youngest prisoner. He would be 35 years old right now. 36 years old. We have no idea, has never been seen again, he and his entire family. So yes, right there we have the precedent for the real fear that if a Dalai Lama from inside Tibet was named by a Tibetan team, that he or she would be kidnapped by the Chinese government again and disappeared. And then the Chinese several days later announced their own boy as the Panchen Lama, who Tibetans inside Tibet have to be respectful toward, but many of are suspicious and call him Zuma, right? Fake. This is a fake Panchen Lama. Okay, the second part is that then a decade later, in 2007, the Chinese government passed something called State Order Number 5. And State Order Number 5 is a proclamation that only the Chinese Communist Party has the authority to recognize Tibetan Buddhist reincarnations. Now, presumably the irony of that is not lost on anyone watching or listening this, right? That an atheist government is claiming for themselves the sole power and authority, right? The legitimacy to recognize a Buddhist lineage. But so again, that was 2007 and that State Order Number 5, where they tried to make this actual law. So there you go.
Before we get to the situation in general of the Tibetan people in the vacuum that will follow the Dalai Lama's death, just continuing the conversation about the Chinese, albeit that no non-collaborator Tibetan and no Buddhist will ever recognize the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist candidate. What kind of efforts do you think the Chinese will make in order to create the trappings of legitimacy and power around their candidate within Tibet, or theoretically within China or the world at large? Well, how do you think they will try to give some oomph to their candidate that in the end no actual person who cares about Tibet or Buddhism will recognize?
The Chinese have something very powerful, which is that they control the land of Tibet. So, for example, the Patala, the Dalai Lama's historic residence monastery, the seat of the Tibetan government, is in Chinese hands. So one of the things that, the Chinese government could do and probably will do when they have announced, a poor, unfortunate child who has been chosen to serve in this role for them as a propaganda piece, is probably sit him on a throne in the Patala, take him to the Norblinka, which was the Dalai Lama's summer palace, right? So they have the visual and symbolic material, right? Like the buildings. They have, the Dalai Lama himself is a symbol of Tibet. The Chinese have access to, the symbols inside the Norblinka, the Patala. They will also probably command the Tibetan people, for example, to come out and line the streets when they bring that child to Tibet, and clap and show their appreciation and their respect and devotion. And the Tibetan people will both have to do this. Some might also do it also out of hedging bets that perhaps, this young child also is someone special. And it is unfortunate that he is also in addition to being potentially a special religious leader, has been, is being used by the Chinese for this purpose. So I was in Tibet in 2005, kind of in between Litang and Darsendo in eastern Tibet. This is in Sichuan province, Tibetan region of Kham, when the Panchen Lama was coming through. And this was the Chinese chosen Panchen Lama. And the road we were on, that we were traveling on, was all traffic had to stop. We had to stand on the side of the road for about 4 hours until the procession came through, car procession, motorcade carrying the Panchen Lama. And everyone was expected to just stand there on the side of the road. There was an old Tibetan woman standing next to me who put up her pinky, which is a sign of kind of disrespect. It said Zuma, she was talking to me. But there was no option, right, to not stop, to not be there, to turn your back. You could just do something in ways that she turned to me and spoke to me. But the performance, of bowing down to the state in a communist society, there's not tons of options to reject or refuse that.
Yeah, this is all standard showmanship for every authoritarian state to make
Yes.
people pretend to support the leader and the government. I mean, it's well known as a Stalinist technique. Now, then turning to this situation of the actual Tibetan people, although you have noted that the Dalai Lama is no longer playing a governmental role in the same way that he did traditionally, and there is a government, a democracy, Nonetheless, on a sort of spiritual, cultural, moral level, his passing will leave a vacuum in the leadership of the Tibetan people, both within Tibet and in the Tibetan diaspora. And at a minimum, even if I would think that there would be the other kind of tulku which would have been born while this Dalai Lama was alive, nonetheless, there will be some fairly long period of an interregnum before the Dalai Lama reaches majority, the next Dalai Lama reaches majority, truly takes the leadership. So who or what institution is going to fill the gap or the vacuum in leadership of the Tibetan people during that period?
I think an important thing to remember is that the Tibetan people have been through this many times over the last 5 centuries, right? So this is not something new. And the stakes feel high right now, but it's also not the first time that the stakes have been high, right? That politics in Tibet have been charged. So in retiring from political power in 2011, the Dalai Lama, created a democracy. And so the Tibetan community in exile has now for 13, 14 years, been led by a democratically elected leader. In English, we would use the word president. In Tibetan, it's Sikyong. The first elected Sikyong was Losang Sengye. He served for 2 terms. Currently, Mr. Pempa Sereng is the Sikyong. So we're in the third term of the Sikyong. So that institution's already in place and has been functioning now. We're like decade and a half in. The other body who is charged now, so if that is the political rule, the religious rule would be under the Ganden Podrang Trust. So again, this is the trust that is charged with running the Dalai Lama's office. So the interregnum period now, which before would have been run by regents who come from a series of determined families, like a group of families, would step in to run as regents. There would be a senior regent or senior kind of tutor and a junior one who were charged with they have both responsibility for religious training of the Dalai Lama, but also running of the political running of the government. Now, the political running of the government will be primarily by the Sikyong and the office of the Sikyong in consultation, right? The Ganden Podrang Trust remains, in consultation with the government. But the exiled government now truly has been charged with running the government on its own, again, through democratic elections. The Ganden Podrang Trust will have tutors for the young Dalai Lama, as well as, whatever, I guess, His Holiness currently sets up ahead of time, as well as the leaders who are running that feel is needed in this new moment. So it's not that this is static. So while there's a process, right, and institutions in place that have been in place for hundreds of years, we also have the new Sikyong, right? So it's kind of, there's the continuity along with the innovation at the same time. All right. So there is absolutely a flexibility, and response to the current situation. And that has been led by His Holiness himself.
But although there is a political structure that will continue and provide leadership and day-to-day administration, etc., nonetheless, particularly for a people for whom leadership has always been embodied in a single individual, I would think it's going to be crucial both to inspire the Tibetan people as well as to represent Tibet and the Tibetan people to the rest of the world, that ideally, for a while, leadership of the Tibetan people would coalesce around some single figure, around whom a spirit can be maintained and presented to the world, and I think probably overshadowed by the tremendous reputation and achievements of the current Dalai Lama. My own guess is that the president or prime minister or any other political figure or really religious figure has not at this point developed sufficient stature to, in effect, act as the focal point for the Tibetan people and the Tibetan cause. If that is indeed would indeed be good. Are there any particularly strong candidates to do that, do you think?
Okay. So yes, let's be clear. The Sikyong is not the Dalai Lama, and is not a substitute for His Holiness at all. The current Dalai Lama is an incredibly charismatic figure, right? And a figure respected and beloved around the world because of who he is and what he has done and how he has led. His teachings on ethics, his teachings on Buddhism, his winning of the Nobel Peace Prize, again, truly singular. The Sikyong, as a democratically elected leader, stands among the world's leaders in a similar position as to other elected leaders. So not the same, and not trying to replicate who His Holiness was. In terms of other Buddhist leaders in the Tibetan community, this might be a period where some of them are asked to, I don't necessarily think represent the Tibetan government necessarily, but perhaps to take on roles beyond just the religious in terms of speaking to questions of politics or the environment or whatever it happens to be in the moment. But I don't see any indication that any current leaders who would be, of the right age to do so, from another school, from Kagyu or Nyingma or Sakya, or even within the Gelugpa school, are going to step into that role. And here's also, I guess, a good time to say that as much as the Dalai Lama has been a religious leader and touchstone, right, and again, teacher for Tibetans for centuries, that you also would not just, I don't want to make this past tense, would have and have had your own teacher, right? From your village monastery or regional monastery, the school that your family belongs to. So it's not as if there's just one leader, right? His Holiness was the leader for all of Tibet, as well as an individual, right, teacher for people. But there's also going to be, it's not as if in between Dalai Lamas, there is no religious leadership, that there is no religious teaching, that there is no religious home or spiritual home to which you can go, right? That is always a multiple thing. Again, as much as the Dalai Lama is singular, you always have your home monastery, the teacher, the school to which your family has, put their faith in, often for generations.
I mean, to conclude, listening to you now, the conclusion that I find myself coming to is that although, of course, there is a system that has for centuries maintained the Dalai Lama lineage and will continue to do that going forward with the death of the current Dalai Lama, that there are institutions in Tibetan society, both political and religious, to maintain their culture, their religion, their sense of being a people, in spite of all the tremendous pressures they are under from the Chinese and from modernity. But that because of the extraordinary character and accomplishments of this particular Dalai Lama, that actually he's irreplaceable both for the Tibetan people and for the world.
I think irreplaceable is a hard term when you're talking about a reincarnation. So each Dalai Lama is a new human being, right? There is continuity, perhaps with actually, I don't want to get into the technical terms of Buddhism. Does the Sem continue at such a high level of reincarnation? I don't fully know that question. Sem, the life force, the heart mind. This Dalai Lama is incredibly, again, accomplished, beloved, respected, magnificent in many ways. I think that we can hope and trust that the next Dalai Lama will be as magnificent, respected, beloved, effective in the world. The Dalai Lama is the embodiment of wisdom and compassion. And so when we think of the next Dalai Lama, the 15th Dalai Lama coming into this world, again, as an embodiment of wisdom and compassion, that is those are the forces that will animate that person. And given that the stakes are so high and so much thought is already being put into the finding of the reincarnation, I guess I kind of join all of those who trust that the job is going to be done correctly, right, and properly, and that the the individual who is found to serve as the next, not just to serve, the individual who is found who is, right, the 15th Dalai Lama, is truly going to have these same qualities. Now, we're going to have to wait several decades again until the person becomes an adult, right? Is an adult and is able to fully do that. But who knows what things will look like when it's a young child, and maybe what sort of interactions are actually going to be meaningful, right? Even in this the period, the minority period, right, when they are when the individual is not ready to fully assume the full extent of the powers. So I guess I think that we can both acknowledge, again, the singularity and the accomplishments of the 14th Dalai Lama, and also trust that the 15th Dalai Lama, we will be able to tell stories that are similar, but also, special to that individual once they are here.
And one could definitely hope that that's the case. And then turning to the other of the Dalai Lama's two roles, which we acknowledge right off the top, which is indeed as the leader of the Tibetan people and as one of the world's leading spiritual and moral voices, really, as far as I'm concerned, one of the great moral statesmen in history, this Dalai Lama. And then we can hope not only that the next Dalai Lama fulfills the role well within Tibetan society, but that whether it's the next Dalai Lama or somebody else from somewhere in this earth, that we find yet another great moral leader who can fill the role that this Dalai Lama has filled so extraordinarily for the world.
I agree. I mean, in some ways, so the Tibetan system is a little different in that we know where the moral leadership will come from, but in other ways, we don't always know, right, where that leadership is going to appear. And the reincarnation system is not one that exists in, necessarily other societies or even other religions. And I guess we are lucky that even in this time of real global distress, that we still have people whose moral compasses are not just intact, but are strong, right, and are leading.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Carole. This has been a very informative and fascinating discussion about a forthcoming event, which will be both sad and very, very important, both for the Tibetan people and for the world. So thank you very much for this conversation.